10 сентября 2005 года на границе Брест с Польшей. 11 часов, уже автобусов больше 20.
Słyszałem to od wielu przywódców, z którymi rozmawiałem o potrzebie zorganizowania wsparcia dla całej flanki wschodniej.
Poland's eastern frontier, often treated as a quiet logistical corridor, abruptly became the focus of world attention in mid-September 2025. After the large-scale Zapad military exercises ended, Warsaw announced that it was closing key border crossings with Belarus. Overnight, thousands of vehicles, freight trains, and ordinary travelers found themselves stranded. Yet the traffic jams and long queues were only the surface of a far larger disruption. By halting the flow of goods along this route, Poland effectively severed one of the most important overland trade arteries connecting China and the European Union. Before the shutdown, this corridor generated an estimated 25 billion euros, roughly $27 billion, in annual commerce, carrying everything from consumer electronics to automobile components. The most critical junction was the Malaczewice terminal in eastern Poland, where Asian and European rail systems meet. Trains from Chinese industrial hubs, Chongqing, Chengdu, Xi'an, and others, regularly delivered thousands of containers for rerouting into the EU. Compared to sea transport, the rail journey was 2 to 3 weeks faster and dramatically cheaper than air freight. For companies built around just-in-time production and rapid e-commerce delivery, the speed of this railway was an essential competitive edge. When Poland closed crossings such as Kuznica-Bruzgi, Terespol-Brest, and Siemianowka, that edge disappeared overnight. Belarusian rail workers reported that the entire system came to a standstill. Containers piled up in warehouses and sidings on the Belarusian side. For Beijing, which had marketed the Belt and Road Rail line as a reliable alternative to maritime shipping, the closure was more than an inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to the credibility of its flagship trade initiative. China's initial response was swift but measured. Foreign Minister Wang Yi contacted his Polish counterpart Radoslaw Sikorski, urging Warsaw to reopen the corridor. During meetings on September 15-16, Chinese officials stressed the importance of stable trade flows and pointed to the economic costs on both sides. Poland, however, framed the closure as a matter of national security, declining to give a timetable for reopening. Officials in Warsaw linked the decision to wider geopolitical concerns: the war in Ukraine, Russian influence in Belarus, and the use of irregular migration as a pressure tactic along the frontier. By controlling this key logistics hub, Poland gained unexpected leverage. The Polish government openly stated that it wanted Beijing to use its influence on Moscow to help end the war in Ukraine, and to discourage Belarus from so-called hybrid operations against the border. In other words, Warsaw was connecting the freedom of trade to security behavior, an explicit break from the long-standing practice of separating commerce from politics. This put China in a delicate position. On one side lay the European Union, its largest overall trading partner and a critical market for Chinese exports. On the other side stood Russia, an increasingly important strategic ally. Poland's action forced Beijing to weigh the economic benefits of Europe against its geopolitical partnership with Moscow. The stakes for China were significant. The Belt and Roads rail link through Poland had become vital for Chinese inland provinces that produce high-value goods such as laptops, smartphones, electric vehicle batteries, and 5G hardware. Sea routes require 30-40 days, rail cuts that to roughly 2 weeks. Disruptions risked penalties for late deliveries, production slowdowns, and a loss of customer confidence, precisely the factors that had helped Chinese exporters compete so effectively. The closure's immediate human impact was striking. Thousands of travelers, families, migrant workers, and business people rushed to border posts after hearing the early morning announcement, only to encounter armed guards and locked gates. Official counts recorded over 1,600 cars and dozens of buses stuck in no man's land, while many more were turned back by Belarusian security forces before reaching the frontier. Economic consequences mounted quickly. Polish state-controlled freight company PKP Cargo warned that if the closure persisted, trade would divert to longer, costlier routes through Kazakhstan, the Caspian Sea, and Turkey. European importers expressed concern about delivery times and supply chain reliability. Chinese factories dependent on uninterrupted rail access faced mounting losses. Warehouses filled to capacity, contracts were cancelled, and billions of yuan in penalties accumulated. The very perception of Chinese goods as fast and reliable began to erode, raising new questions for European buyers. If Poland can close the border overnight, how secure is this supply line? Inside China, any extended slowdown threatens more than profits. The Chinese Communist Party's domestic legitimacy is closely tied to sustained economic growth. Reduced shifts, cancelled bonuses or layoffs in major inland manufacturing centers could fuel social tension, a risk Beijing takes seriously. Poland's decision reverberated far beyond the immediate trade disruption. For decades, Europe largely separated economic cooperation from security concerns, assuming that commerce could remain insulated from geopolitics. Warsaw's action challenged that assumption head-on. By linking border access to China's stance on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Poland effectively announced a new doctrine: security first, trade second. This approach resonated with several Eastern European states that share Poland's concerns about Russian aggression and hybrid threats. Governments in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia publicly expressed understanding for Poland's position, noting that the EU must be ready to defend its borders and interests even at economic cost. In contrast, some Western capitals reacted with caution. Berlin and Paris emphasized the importance of maintaining open trade with China, Europe's largest single source of manufactured imports. Yet they stopped short of criticizing Warsaw outright, aware of the symbolic power of a country on the EU's frontier taking decisive action when the conflict in Ukraine remained unresolved. This dynamic highlighted a broader transformation. Eastern Europe is no longer merely a buffer zone. Countries like Poland, Lithuania, and Finland increasingly shape EU security debates, showing that regional actors can set the agenda when major powers hesitate. For Beijing, the closure was both an economic and diplomatic wake-up call. The Belt and Road rail corridor through Poland had become a showcase of China-Europe connectivity, cutting delivery times for e-commerce giants such as Shein, Temu, and Alibaba. Now, the sudden halt exposed a key vulnerability: reliance on a single transit route controlled by an EU and NATO member. Chinese officials faced conflicting priorities: maintain ties with Russia, a strategic partner and energy supplier that counters US influence; protect exports to Europe, which account for hundreds of billions of dollars annually and support millions of jobs in China's coastal and inland provinces. In private, Chinese trade representatives reportedly explored alternate rail routes through Kazakhstan and the Caucasus, or maritime shipping via the Suez Canal. Yet those options are slower, costlier, and less predictable. Even if feasible, they cannot fully replace the speed and capacity of the Poland-Belarus corridor. Diplomatically, Beijing sought to de-escalate. Statements from the Chinese Foreign Ministry avoided harsh language, calling instead for constructive dialogue and mutually beneficial solutions. Analysts noted that China refrained from overt retaliation such as tariffs on Polish exports, perhaps reflecting the importance of maintaining broader EU relations. While high-level negotiations continued, the economic ripple effects deepened within China itself. Factories in Chongqing, Chengdu, Xi'an, and Lanzhou, major centers for electronics and automotive components, reported production slowdowns. Many operate on just-in-time supply chains, so even a 2-week delay in outbound shipments forced costly adjustments, cutting shifts, reducing overtime, or temporarily storing unsold goods. These disruptions carry a political dimension. The Chinese government derives much of its domestic legitimacy from consistent economic growth and rising living standards. When wages stagnate or layoffs loom, public frustration can grow, especially in provinces that have benefited from export-driven development. Economists warned that prolonged rail blockages could erode investor confidence and weaken the narrative of the Belt and Road as a stable global logistics network. Financial analysts in Shanghai noted that foreign clients might diversify sourcing to Southeast Asia or India to avoid dependence on a single trade route vulnerable to geopolitics. For ordinary Chinese citizens, these macroeconomic tremors manifest in tangible ways: smaller bonuses, reduced overtime pay, and higher consumer prices for imported raw materials. While no mass protests erupted, social media discussions revealed unease about how distant geopolitical tensions could affect household incomes. While most attention focused on Poland and China, Belarus occupied an uneasy middle ground. President Alexander Lukashenko's government has long balanced between Moscow's political influence and the economic opportunities of acting as a transit hub for Chinese goods. The sudden shutdown left Belarus both economically exposed and politically constrained. Thousands of Belarusian truck drivers were stranded, unable to return to their jobs in Poland or reach their own country. local logistics firms reported warehouses overflowing with containers meant for onward travel into the EU. Time-sensitive cargo such as pharmaceuticals and fresh food risked spoilage. Belarusian authorities initially criticized Poland's move as an unfriendly act, yet their ability to respond was limited. Any attempt to pressure Warsaw could invite stronger EU sanctions, while leaning more heavily on Moscow might deepen dependence on Russia. Precisely the dynamic many Belarusians fear. From a broader perspective, the episode underscored how small transit states can become vulnerable chess pieces in larger geopolitical contests. Belarus profits from its role as a bridge between Asia and Europe, but it lacks the leverage to dictate terms when major powers clash. Analysts across Europe and Asia quickly began assessing the potential long-term consequences of Poland's decision. For Europe, the incident highlighted the need for diversified supply routes. The EU has already invested in new rail and port infrastructure in the Baltic states, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean. Poland's action may accelerate projects such as the Rail Baltica corridor and expanded Black Sea shipping networks to reduce dependence on any single choke point. For China, the closure serves as a cautionary tale. The Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) has relied heavily on the promise of speed, reliability, and political neutrality. By showing that a single EU member can effectively sever a major artery, the crisis exposed how trade routes are inseparable from politics. Future BRI planning may shift toward maritime blue routes or multiple overland paths through Central Asia and the Middle East to avoid over-reliance on Eastern Europe. For global markets, the event added to concerns about supply chain resilience. After the COVID-19 pandemic, businesses were already re-evaluating dependence on just-in-time manufacturing. The Polish shutdown reinforced the importance of redundant logistics networks, encouraging companies to keep more inventory on hand or source goods from a wider array of regions. Geopolitically, Poland's move signaled a new confidence among mid-sized powers. By leveraging its geography and EU membership, Warsaw demonstrated that a nation of 38 million can influence the behavior of the world's second-largest economy and reshape conversations in Brussels, Berlin, and Beijing alike. As weeks passed, limited freight traffic gradually resumed via alternative routes, but the episode left lasting marks on diplomacy, commerce, and public perception. For Poland, the closure reaffirmed its status as a frontline state capable of shaping European security policy. It also underscored the strategic importance of linking economic openness to national security, a principle that may guide EU policy in future crises. For China, the event illustrated how economic power alone cannot guarantee access to key markets. Maintaining stable relations with the EU will likely require greater diplomatic flexibility and perhaps a clearer position on conflicts that affect European security, especially the war in Ukraine. For Belarus, the crisis revealed the limits of strategic ambiguity. Dependent on both Russia and the EU's economic sphere, Minsk may face increasing pressure to clarify its own alliances or risk further isolation. Ultimately, the border closure stands as a case study in the interdependence of trade and geopolitics. A decision made in Warsaw rippled through factories in Chongqing, boardrooms in Berlin, and policy circles in Beijing. It demonstrated how a single choke point can influence global supply chains and challenge assumptions about globalization's stability. For more balanced, in-depth analysis of global events like this, subscribe to our MGE channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.